Hey, RetconRaider here. It has been a while since we last chatted about Fallout Van Buren, hasn't it? It's been a few months, I think, maybe 3 years, since we first started our analysis of Design Document 15, so I thought it was about high time we finally got around to maybe wrapping that up. Now, just real quick, before we get started, folks have asked me why I dropped off the series for so long, and I've answered it in bits and pieces in various places, but I'll just go on the record here. There are multiple reasons, but the short of it is that my old computer exploded. I had to jump through hoops to rebuild my old Van Buren notes and reference libraries, and honestly, Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 really kind of dampened my enthusiasm for the franchise, at least where lore is concerned. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed both games for what they were, but I also think that lore and storytelling are generally two of Bethesda's weakest points. Trying to reconcile their nonsense with pre-existing canon it got very frustrating. That aside, I think it's also pretty obvious that my recording style has changed slightly over the past few years. The bulk of the original Van Buren series was made when I was just getting started. I had never actually recorded myself before that, so as a result, those early videos are all pretty rough around the edges. I'd actually love to go back and remake them someday. But that is, of course, well beyond the scope of this particular video. That said, today, we're just going to try to get this train moving again, as opposed to rebuilding it from the ground up. Now, where did I put those tracks? There we go. Let's get started. Alright, so today we are going to finally continue our analysis of Design Document 15, which covers the Bloomfield Space Center. We've already covered the layout and NPCs in previous videos, so all that's left at this point is to go over the quests and consequences that were planned for this late-game location. That is actually easier said than done, because, similar to the Reservation, another location designed by Damien Folletto, the Bloomfield Space Center actually had a fairly complicated series of interlocking quests that were intended to play out at different times throughout the overarching campaign, and often ended up overlapping with other major quest arcs from different locations. On top of that, because the design document was undergoing active revision when development was officially cancelled, there's a fair amount of redundant or conflicting information scattered throughout the document, not to mention entire chunks that are marked for deletion, which theoretically wouldn't have actually made it into the final game. With that in mind, as much as I hate to say it, we are going to split this content into two main chunks. First, we'll talk about the optional content that was more or less planned for the first half of the campaign, which largely revolves around a raider gang known as the Rusty Hooks. And then next time, we'll move on to the content that was planned for Act 2, which was actually mandatory. That content focused on restoring the facility and prepping the Hermes 13 for launch. I wanted to include that in this video, but unfortunately it ended up getting much more complicated than I expected it to, because it turns out there were a lot of unfinished placeholders for all sorts of plot devices that the player would end up having to collect just to get their ass to Mars. Bomb 1, sorry. Though to be fair, the Hermes shuttles were originally intended for use in manned missions to Mars. It was only once the war broke out that they got repurposed for use in the bomb program. Anyway, we'll talk about that next time. Now, first of all, I suppose we should touch on how the player was supposed to find their way to Bloomfield in the first place. It was tucked into the very southwestern corner of the map, well away from almost every other notable location, aside from Hoover Dam. As a somewhat secretive pre-war facility, there were no roads or tracks leading to Bloomfield, but there were at least a few different ways that the player could be pointed in the right direction. This actually overlaps with a number of the documents we've previously explored. For example, The player could learn the location of Bloomfield after their encounter with Dr. Victor Presper in Boulder Dome, as described in Design Document Number 3. They could also learn Bloomfield's location at the Reservation, Design Document Number 14, where they could either learn it from Gillian McKinley, the Rusty Hook's former mechanic, or from Dr. Willem Clark's pre-war archives. If they somehow missed all that, there were still other ways they could theoretically be pointed in the right direction. One of the optional bounty hunter quests in Hoover Dam, for example, Design Document 12, offered a reward for Kyle the Hook's head, and would have included some basic information about where he might be found. The player could also inadvertently stumble across Rusty Hook patrols while traveling through the area surrounding Bloomfield, south of Hoover Dam on the world map, which could theoretically result in the player being pointed towards the elusive location. Now, aside from the unique encounters related to SOR-1000 Gamma, the inadvertent escapee from Bomb Station 1, we didn't really end up talking about the random encounters around Bloomfield in either of the previous two videos. Let's go ahead and touch on that real quick. Might as well be thorough. They're actually pretty straightforward. Overall, there were 5 generic random encounters planned for the area around Bloomfield. 2 focused on hag snakes, 2 focused on Rusty Hook patrols, and 1 focused on both. These encounters were all repeatable, but it is important to note that there were only a total of 22 generic members of the Rusty Hook's Raider gang, and the game would keep track of their losses over time. If these numbers were ever depleted, then the encounters would simply stop triggering, and presumably, the Rusty Hooks would stop appearing at the Bloomfield space station as well. It's also worth noting that unless the player intervened, Kyle the Hook would eventually run the Rusty Hooks into the ground, getting himself killed in the process. But we'll save that for next time. That's more epilogue material. Right now we're focused on quests. The simplest of these encounters involve the player being confronted by a patrol and warned to leave the area. 2 variants of this encounter involved the player stumbling onto a Rusty Hook patrol that was already entrenched in battle with another group of hostiles. This could either be a rival group of raiders or a pesky pack of hag snakes. In either case, the player could net some potential loot and XP by wading into the fray. If they helped the Rusty Hooks, then it would of course net them some easy reputation with the gang, while attacking the Rusty Hooks would instead reduce it. It is interesting to note that despite being raiders, the Rusty Hooks are described as not really being all that bad or violent. Well, aside from Kyle, that is. They were described as doing what they did to survive. They would only attack the player if they were provoked, though it was possible to essentially coerce them into mugging the player if the player was particularly bad with words. The clear intention here was to encourage the player to stay on speaking terms with the gang, because that would allow the player to find out more about the Rusty Hooks, possibly even allowing them to do some light trading, or get pointed towards Bloomfield proper. If the player was currently bringing Jillian back to Bloomfield, then that would make things even simpler. The patrol would escort them the rest of the way. Now, before we move on to Bloomfield proper, let's take a quick detour with the hag snakes. I don't think we've ever actually talked about the mutant hag snakes that were planned to appear in Van Buren, despite the fact that they were actually featured in multiple other documents, including Hoover Dam, Burham Springs, and the nursery. So let's go ahead and fix that real quick. Hag snakes were radioactive mutant hagfish, generally only found near bodies of water, but capable of at least temporarily moving on land, similar to snakes. They generally ranged in size from as small as 7 feet to as large as 14 feet long, sporting slimy purple and green leather-like skin, beady red eyes, and round lamprey-like mouths filled with sharp, serrated teeth. In combat, they would attempt to grapple and bite their targets like a snake, and on a critical success, they would implant living targets with a parasitic egg. It would take this implanted egg 2 months to fully gestate inside the character, during which time the victim would suffer a -1 penalty to their endurance score. The reason for this penalty would not be immediately apparent, but it could be easily diagnosed and treated by any character with a decent medical skill and a proper doctor's bag. If instead allowed to hatch, the victim would then suffer a -3 penalty to endurance, as the newborn hag snake began eating them from the inside out. If this was allowed to continue for another week, then the victim would eventually die, with the fully grown hag snake subsequently crawling out of their hollowed-out corpse. Delightful. In regards to Bloomfield specifically, hag snakes could be encountered in small nests near dried-up streams, or the player could end up stumbling across major hag snake nests near large bodies of water. In the former case, the encounters would be a mere nuisance, consisting of 4 to 6 smaller, weaker hag snakes, about 7 feet long, only posing a threat to lower-level players, generally level 3 or below. In the latter case, however, major nests would feature about a dozen or more smaller hag snakes, and one much larger, much more dangerous, 14-foot hag snake. These major nests would also feature numerous scattered bodies of dead or comatose victims, providing a potential valuable source of loot. The player would have to kill the hag snakes to collect most of this loot, but the task would of course be made much simpler if the player was already implanted with an egg. In that case, the hag snakes would actually ignore them, allowing them to explore the nest and collect the loot unhindered. Now, regardless of exactly how the player got there, they would eventually find their way to Bloomfield proper. It was a mandatory part of the game, so it was either that, or simply not progress beyond a certain point. The facility was well secured, surrounded by a deadly electric fence on all sides, except for an open gap on the south. If the player was a particularly talented science boy with appropriate tools, they could cut a gap through the fence and enter that way. Otherwise, they would need to circle around to the south and enter along the main concourse, which would actually trigger a special event. But again, we'll get to that in just a moment. First, it's worth noting that while the player could simply walk through the open gap in the revised document, a section of the document that was marked for deletion indicates that entrance into Bloomfield was originally intended to be a bit more difficult. Prior to being cut for space, Bloomfield would have actually featured a smaller entrance submap consisting of 2 smaller structures, a collapsed parking garage and the Bloomfield Space Museum. Those 2 locations would have also encompassed the 2 original Point of Contact side quests, also marked for deletion, which would have helped dictate the player's initial standing with the rusty hooks. Unless the player opted to cut a hole in the electric fence, they would have had to instead navigate their way through the heavily trapped, maze-like parking structure. This would have triggered one of the 2 deleted quests, more of an optional sub-objective really, to find their way through the parking garage unscathed. Thankfully, the traps were relatively crude, consisting primarily of concealed spike pits, rebar-mounted spear traps, and tripwires attached to grenades. The player could use their outdoorsman skill to avoid these traps by following the most well-traveled paths, or they could use their trap skill to detect and disarm the traps before stumbling into them. Either way, making it through the parking garage without setting off any of the traps would net the player a minor experience bonus. Once through the parking garage, the player would then find themselves confronted by 4 Rusty Hook guards stationed in the attached museum. This would have triggered the second deleted quest, to convince the Rusty Hook guards to allow passage. Though in this case, convince is a somewhat relative term. This would have actually been a very straightforward but relatively flexible quest. If the player was traveling with Jillian, then the quest would be trivialized. They would immediately be granted access, but this would also reduce the amount of experience points they gained. Otherwise, they could use their speech skills to convince the guards they were interested in trading, which would net them a meeting with Bear. They could use science skills to convince the guards that they were technologically adept, which would net them a meeting with Sid. They could use stealth to sneak past the guards, or they could simply use combat to brute force their way through. All of these options would grant a medium experience reward, and would all essentially accomplish the same thing, though some might have a higher body count than others. The original sequence of events would then have the player inadvertently trigger an encounter with 2 sentry robots as soon as they got about halfway into the main complex. We touched on this in a previous video, but these robots were part of the original security system for Bloomfield Space Center, and it lay dormant for the past 150 or so years, to the point where the rusty hooks had really just started treating them as scenery. Now, however, they were under standing orders by Odysseus to watch out for Tibbet's escapees. As soon as they spotted the player or Gillian McKinley, they would attack, but the sounds of combat would quickly draw the attention of the rusty hooks, who would then freak out and assist the player in fighting the robots. Afterwards, the rusty hooks would have no idea that it was the player or Gillian's fault that the robots had suddenly become hostile. Bear would come out to thank the players personally for helping them against these rogue robots, presumably opening the door for a more diplomatic approach, even if the player's initial contact with the Rusty Hook patrols or guards had otherwise been negative. In the revised version of the document, the parking garage and museum were removed, making the encounter with the sentry robots the player's first major point of contact with Bear. It's theoretically possible that they could have met with Sid first, since he would be present in the rocket assembly hangar just to the left of the main entrance, but he was one of the few completely non-hostile NPCs in Bloomfield. The player would still end up having to trigger the special sentry bot encounter to proceed any farther into the compound, again essentially resetting relations with the gang for players who had made a bad first impression, but now wanted to make a more diplomatic approach. This, of course, brings us to the main bulk of the Bloomfield content planned for Act 1, which, as aforementioned, revolved around the Rusty Hooks. While simply slaughtering the gang wholesale was certainly a viable option, and one that came with a boatload of experience points and potential loot, that would also block out over a dozen associated side quests, and there were short and long-term benefits to be gained with a less heavy-handed strategy. At its most basic, for example, getting on their good side would allow the player to trade with the Rusty Hooks, as long as they didn't mind dealing in stolen goods. Bear would handle the bulk of this type of trading, but the player could also purchase scavenged goods from Sid, though his prices would be unusually high. There are even some indications that the player would be able to trade with other generic members of the gang as well, potentially netting some very valuable pieces of pre-war tech, such as functional holodisks for dirt-cheap prices, because, aside from Bear and Sid, the rank-and-file Rusty Hooks generally had no idea how any of those things actually worked. If the player not only stayed on the gang's good side, but also got in good with Kyle the Hook, then they would be allowed to accompany the gang on their trade-and-raid sessions. Similar to working with the slavers in Fallout 2, this would allow less scrupulous players to prey on random caravans for a chance at some easy loot and XP. It is important to note, though, that due to the remote location of the Bloomfield Space Center, these extended raiding expeditions generally took about a month to complete. Given that several of the story components in Van Buren would have been time-sensitive, this would essentially serve as a trap if the player wasn't careful. It would be significantly safer if the player had already completed Act 1 and effectively cured the new plague, but even then the gang would still end up imploding if Kyle the Hook was still in charge after a 6-month period. The only way for the player to gain access to a stable, long-term raiding operation was by removing Kyle before 6 months had passed, and then installing themselves as his replacement. This was one of several potential resolutions to a series of optional side quests that would ultimately allow the player to influence the gang's future development. Now, before we really dig into this tangle of side quests, it's important to understand the somewhat complex interactions and motivations of all the key players. We actually covered a lot of this in the previous episode, but it is worth at least touching on the broad strokes to provide better context for the related quests. The Rusty Hook quest arc mainly revolved around resolving or taking advantage of the drama between the gang's 3 most prominent members: Kyle the Hook, his bodyguard, Bear, and Sid, the reluctant replacement mechanic. First, you had Kyle the Hook, the incompetent and self-destructively violent leader of the Rusty Hooks. He was deeply unpopular with his fellows, but had seized control of the gang by assassinating its previous leader about 3 years earlier, and now maintained his tenuous rule through intimidation and fear. He controlled Sid with a constant deluge of insults and death threats, and he likewise controlled Bear via an explosive device that he had forced Sid to implant, at gunpoint. He was incredibly short-sighted and self-serving. He absolutely would not hesitate to kill either Bear or Sid if they ever stepped out of line, despite the fact that killing either of them would just expedite the gang's inevitable demise. Bear, on the other hand, was a surprisingly intelligent and personable super mutant who once served in the Master's army. He was a former caravan guard for the Crimson Caravan Company who had been enslaved by Kyle after an unfortunate encounter with the Rusty Hooks. He now served as Kyle's bodyguard and right-hand man, though of course he absolutely hated Kyle. He just understood that he couldn't risk turning on Kyle until he had found some way to neutralize the bomb in his chest. In the meantime, he was essentially the main driving force behind keeping the gang alive. Though Kyle liked to play at being the leader, Bear was the one who actually handled the logistics and day-to-day operations. This made him popular with the rest of the gang, including Sid. In fact, Bear even knew that Sid was the one who had implanted the bomb in his chest, but he had nonetheless befriended the unfortunate mechanic, bonding over the fact that they were both ultimately just victims of Kyle's cruel impulses. For his part, Sid really just wanted to be left alone. While he was mechanically gifted, he really had no interest in acting as the gang's mechanic, but had been forced to assume the role by Kyle after Jillian McKinley's disappearance. He would welcome the opportunity to step down and go back to focusing on his own pet projects, but he couldn't, because he knew that Kyle would kill him if he ever outlived his usefulness. The stress of living under the constant threat of death was making Sid increasingly anxious and emotionally volatile, while the knowledge of what he had done to Bear, and their subsequent friendship, was exacerbating his feelings of guilt and making him dangerously depressed. This would ultimately serve as the primary catalyst for a slew of ensuing quests that would allow the player to ultimately resolve or take advantage of the situation. As a final note, Jillian McKinley, the gang's actual lead mechanic, could also get involved in these quests if the player rescued her from the reservation before starting this particular chain of events. That said, she seemed to primarily serve an ancillary role to the bulk of these side quests. She could help facilitate certain results or outcomes, but it was ultimately up to the player to decide exactly how things would end up resolving. Having her present would help achieve certain results, but it was by no means mandatory. The first step towards resolving this sequence of events was to get the full picture of what was going on. Speaking with Kyle wouldn't get the player anywhere, and pushing him would lead to eventual hostilities. Kyle did not like being questioned. Fortunately, the player would have slightly more luck getting the truth from Bear or Sid. In Bear's case, it would require at least 85 points in Persuade to get him to come clean. But Sid was slightly easier to coerce, with the initial difficulty set at 80 Persuade. The interesting thing with Sid, however, was that the document implied the player could reduce the difficulty of that initial Persuade check by earning his trust, which could be accomplished by helping him with his other projects. More tech-savvy players could help Sid improve Bloomfield subreactor efficiency, or they could help complete Sid's experimental Mega Flamer, while less technologically inclined players could instead help him with various other simpler tasks. Restoring the subreactor was relatively straightforward, portrayed as a simple mechanics or science check. The reactor was currently stuck running at just 45% efficiency, which was only enough to power basic facilities: the internal lights, the electric fence, and some bare-bones computer functionality. It wouldn't take much to get the reactor running at 60%. In fact, Jillian could get it there automatically if the player brought her back to Bloomfield. It could also be accomplished by any CNPC with appropriate technical skills, such as Arcade Ganon or Auto Steed. A potential alternative would be offered if the player admitted to Sid that they didn't know how to fix a generator. In that case, Sid would instead ask the player to scrounge up a science skill book for him. If the player did so, then Sid would use it to increase his own technical skills, allowing him to boost the subreactor up to 60% efficiency. This, of course, would deprive the player of a rather valuable skill book, but it would also net them a modest reward of 500 caps, a 10% discount when trading with Sid, and, most importantly, it would earn a bit of goodwill with Sid, making it slightly easier to get to the truth. Restoring the facility to 60% power would reactivate the facility's external floodlights, unlock more computer functionality, and reactivate the main mission control room. This would actually be mandatory during Act 2, since having a functional control room would be a vital part of prepping the Hermes 13 for launch. In the short term, it would grant a large amount of XP, about 2,000 or so, as well as some new lore via the mission control computers, plus a modest reputation boost with the rusty hooks, not to mention netting even more goodwill from Sid. Particularly skilled players could boost the reactor efficiency even higher, up to 75% or even 85%, though the exact benefits for doing this are somewhat hazy. The document does mention that higher reactor efficiency would restore even more facility functionality, and there are vague references to a couple of secondary computers that would only function at these higher efficiency levels. However, it sounded like the only real benefits here would be access to even more lore. Stuff about Bloomfield, the Hermes rockets, and the bomb program. I do have some general speculation about the potential benefits of that, but that gets more into Act 2 content, so we'll come back to that next time. The other main project that the player could help Sid with was the Mega Flamer, a giant makeshift flamethrower that he had built by mounting a modified rocket thruster onto the detached bed of a pickup truck. The design document mentions that the player could help to varying degrees, earning a variable reward based not only on how much work they did, but also how much credit they were willing to share with Sid for completing the project. If the player did the bulk of the work, but also gave Sid all of the credit, then Sid would be incredibly grateful. This would net the player a hefty 30% discount when trading with Sid, and drastically boost his confidence. If the player helped Sid and shared equal credit with him, then Sid would grant him a reduced 15% discount, but still be grateful. If the player did most of the work, but only gave Sid token credit, then Sid would react in kind by granting them a paltry 5% discount as a token reward. All of these options would also grant the player a medium experience point award. An interesting side note here, though, is that regardless of the amount of work that they actually did on the Mega Flamer, the player could still claim all the credit for getting it up and running. Kyle already had a low opinion of Sid's technical abilities, so it wouldn't take much to convince him that the player was just a much better mechanic. In this case, Kyle would actually execute Sid on the spot and declare the player to be the gang's new mechanic. This would obviously prevent the player from trading with Sid. He'd be dead. But that would be somewhat offset by the fact that the player could now freely loot Sid's workshop. I'll also note that there does seem to be a slight disconnect between how this quest is described in the design document versus how it seems to play out in Sid's partial dialogue files. In the dialogue files, Sid instead asks the player to help siphon rocket fuel into the Mega Flamer's fuel tank. Not exactly a complex technical task. It's possible that this was intended to be a replacement for the more complex quest outlined in the design document, or it could have been a supplementary task that the player could accomplish in addition to that quest. Either way, it was an extraordinarily easy task to accomplish. If the player agreed to siphon rocket fuel, then Sid would reward them with 500 caps and another 10% discount on his trade goods. The player would automatically succeed at siphoning, but if their endurance was less than 7, they would inadvertently swallow some rocket fuel in the process. This would saddle them with a -1 penalty to endurance for the next 24 hours. If the player refused to siphon the fuel, then Sid would instead ask them to at least help with monitoring the fuel gauge while he did it himself. If the player agreed to this, they would still net a reduced reward of 250 caps and a 10% discount. However, characters with sufficient technical skills would also notice a way to improve the Mega Flamer's design while monitoring the gauges. They would still only gain a 250 cap reward, but Sid would bump their discount up to 15%. Regardless of exactly how the player went about doing it, getting the Mega Flamer operational would open up a rather intriguing new option. The player could use Persuade to convince the Rusty Hooks to gather for a demonstration of this fantastical new weapon. This would grant the player a unique opportunity to wipe out the entire gang in one fell swoop, Kyle included, by simply turning the weapon on them during this demonstration. Although this would obviously close off several other potential side quests, it would also remove the Rusty Hooks from play without the need for a long, drawn-out battle. The player would be rewarded with a medium amount of experience points as a reward for their ingenuity, as well as whatever loot survived the gang's impromptu incineration. Assuming the player did not get Sid killed and didn't go scorched earth and wipe out the entire gang, completing one or both of the previous projects would help convince Sid to admit what was really going on with Bear and Kyle. This would grant a medium amount of experience points and unlock additional quests related to Bear's heart bomb. In fact, if the player was particularly persuasive, then Sid would also admit that Kyle had forced him to implant the heart bomb at gunpoint, and how terrible he felt about doing it. He would also explain that he was already working on a way to potentially make amends, and would present the player with a partially completed signal jammer that, if finished, could be used to prevent Kyle from remotely detonating the bomb. At this point, the player would now have access to numerous additional options and potential side quests. There are a truly incredible number of ways the player could have apparently ended up resolving this situation. For example, the player could now go and speak with Bear or Kyle about what they had learned. Speaking to Kyle was obviously a bad idea, because he would be enraged to discover that Sid had been blabbing about his secrets. He would angrily dismiss the player, then head straight over and shoot Sid in the head. This would of course upset Bear, limiting the player's future interactions with him, though the situation could still theoretically be resolved by convincing Bear to play along with Sid's plan to use the partially completed signal jammer and secure his freedom. Speaking with Bear, on the other hand, would now allow the player to completely bypass the normal persuade check required to get Bear to talk about what Kyle had done to him. This would not only provide the player with more details about the situation, but it would more importantly reveal that the detonator was disguised as a gaudy but broken watch that Kyle always wore on his right wrist. It would also, more importantly, allow the player to now discuss various potential solutions with Bear. If the player had sufficient medical and technical expertise, they could actually resolve the situation immediately by convincing Bear to let them manually disable the bomb in his chest. According to the partial dialogue files, this would require a rather hefty 120 points in mechanics and a more modest 50 in medical to accomplish. If the bomb was disabled, Bear would thank the player and go exact vengeance on a very surprised Kyle. The player could also easily resolve the situation by completing the signal jammer that Sid might have ended up giving them. In that case, they could convince Bear to get close to Kyle the next day, inside the jammer's range, which would allow Bear to then beat down Kyle and take away the detonator. If the player did not have access to the jammer, possibly because Sid had already been killed during the earlier interactions, then they could instead try to manually disable the detonator by sneaking up on Kyle while he was sleeping and using the mechanic skill to sabotage it. If the player had rescued Jillian and was still on good terms with her, they could have her sabotage the watch for them instead. A slight variant to this approach would be to instead steal the watch, but this would require an exceptionally high stealth skill. The player could improve their chances by getting Kyle drunk beforehand, which would make it a little easier to get the watch off his wrist without waking him up. The main advantage of this approach would be that the player would end up in possession of the detonator, allowing them to either free Bear and resolve the situation as before, or use it to enslave him as they saw fit. An even more extreme variant of this approach was to temporarily steal Kyle's watch, just long enough to rewire it with explosives. Again, if Jillian was still around, she would be willing to help with booby-trapping the watch, but the player would have to handle the stealing on their own. If this was successfully accomplished, then the next day Bear would confront Kyle, prompting Kyle to attempt to execute Bear, only for the booby-trapped watch, to then detonate, blowing off his one good hand. Regardless of which of these approaches the player decided to take, all of these scenarios would result in more or less the same outcome. Kyle would be removed as leader of the gang, and Bear would be free. This would be met with a standard medium amount of XP, as well as a special title, Samaritan, or Slaver if the player had decided to enslave Bear. If the player tricked Kyle into blowing off his own hand, then they would also earn another special title, Angel of Vengeance. This would also open the possibility of recruiting Bear as a potential companion, though it is interesting to note that if the player didn't end up recruiting Bear, he would still end up abandoning the Rusty Hooks to their fate. Instead, he would leave Bloomfield and return to Hoover Dam, presumably to resume working with the Crimson Caravan Company. The player could encounter him there later, and presumably still recruit him, but it's unclear as to exactly what effect this would end up having on the now leaderless Rusty Hooks, especially given the friendships that Bear had apparently forged with characters like Sid and Jillian. A more complex but potentially beneficial solution would be to instead challenge Kyle for leadership of the Rusty Hooks. At its most basic, this would result in the player having to win a fist fight against Bear, who would be standing in as Kyle's champion. Assuming the player successfully won this fight, they would depose Kyle as leader and lay claim to all of his possessions, including the detonator. A slight variant of this would be to instead use the signal jammer acquired from Sid to convince Bear to throw the fight in exchange for his freedom. In this case, the player would handily win the leadership challenge because Bear would deliberately let them win. At that point, the player could either disable the detonator and grant Bear his freedom, or use it to enslave Bear, much in the same way that Kyle had. Legitimately defeating Bear in a fistfight without having him throw it would also earn a special perk, Sting Like a Bee, which would grant a plus 5% to crit chance, but only with unarmed attacks. Perhaps more notably, the player would now also find themselves controlling their very own gang. The details here are scarce, but they would apparently get to rename the gang and decide what direction it would end up evolving in. They could have the gang focus on lawful pursuits such as scavenging and trading, or have them focus on raiding instead. There are vague allusions to being able to upgrade the facility, or even eventually give the gang control of some of the high-tech resources unique to Bloomfield. They could, of course, also have the gang focus on raiding instead, and depending on their exact approach, it would earn them yet another special title, Born Leader for pushing the gang towards lawful pursuits, or either Kingpin or Criminal Mastermind for raiding, as well as a regular share of whatever profits the gang managed to make. For players who simply wanted to sow chaos or rack up a body count, there were two other fun but depraved options. The first was to trick Bear into confronting Kyle by pretending to have a functional jamming device. This would require at least 120 deception to pull off, and failing this check would result in Bear refusing to interact with the player any further. If successful, however, it would play out in much the same way as the normal signal jammer scenario, but with one key difference. Bear would confront Kyle, expecting the jammer to protect him from being executed, but the detonator would work as intended. Bear's heart bomb would explode, resulting in a blast large enough to not only kill the super mutant, but also Kyle, who would be standing nearby. The gang's entire leadership would be wiped out in one fell swoop, effectively destroying the Rusty Hooks without the player ever having to fire a shot. This would reward the player with the Instigator epithet, as well as the standard medium XP. On a similar but much more depraved note, the player could also abuse Sid's fragile emotional state by persuading or deceiving him into killing Kyle himself. In this case, the player would need to use exceptional speechcraft to convince Sid that there was no other way to make amends for what he had done. It would take some doing, but eventually Sid would accept the argument, using a C4-laden vest to kill both himself and Kyle. This would effectively free Bear, but Bear would become very upset if he learned about the player's involvement in Sid's death. On the other hand, it would also grant the player a medium amount of XP, the loot in Sid's workshop, the special Devil's Proxy epithet, and even a special perk, Devil's Tongue, which would grant a plus 5% bonus to their deception skill. Assuming the player was not in fact a monster, they could actually do the opposite of that as well. They could instead help Sid come to grips with what he had been forced to do. Helping Sid complete his various projects around Bloomfield would already go a long way towards boosting his self-esteem, as would gifting him skill books or otherwise teaching him to be a better mechanic. Particularly persuasive players could even help talk him through his problems, and once Sid's self-esteem was boosted high enough, the quest would be resolved. Successfully completing this quest would reward the player with a medium amount of XP, grant even more discounts on his traded goods, and net the player an advanced toolkit. The player would also receive the special Therapist epithet, as well as the Guidance Counselor perk, which would grant an additional plus 5% bonus to their Persuade skill. Now, we've saved what is likely the most ideal solution to the Rusty Hook scenario for last. Going back a little, it was actually possible to combine the Leadership Challenge scenario with some of the other solutions. If the player disabled or jammed Kyle's detonator, they could then convince Bear to issue the Leadership Challenge himself. This would normally prompt Kyle to immediately execute Bear, but in this case, the detonator would fail, and Bear would easily triumph in the ensuing fight. Kyle would be deposed, probably dead, and unlike most of the other scenarios, Bear would not abandon the Rusty Hooks. Instead, as their new leader, he would immediately start cleaning up Bloomfield and changing the gang into a legitimate salvaging and trading operation. Instead of raiding, the gang would now focus on gathering materials in and around Bloomfield, crafting metal goods, restoring pre-war artifacts, and trading with the surrounding settlements. Over time, there would be visible improvements made to the Bloomfield facility. After 1 month, he would remove any traps from the facility's entrance, including the traps in the parking garage, if, it hadn't already been marked for deletion. After 2 months, he would also clear away the collapsed observation building between the hangar and the mission control building, replacing it with a farming area. After 6 full months, all the debris and graffiti around the facility would also be cleaned up. This would grant the player numerous potential rewards, including the Born Leader, Instigator, and Samaritan epithets. It would also grant the usual XP reward, but it is very interesting to note that this approach does not appear to unlock Bear as a potential companion, which makes sense, given that he would now be responsible for the success and survival of his very own settlement. As a consolation prize, however, the player would presumably be on good terms with Bear and his friends, and they would now be able to establish trading routes between Bloomfield and other areas. This delves into what was intended to be an overarching trade quest planned for Van Buren, which unfortunately we just don't really know a whole lot about. In theory, depending on the player's initial negotiations with Bear, they could also secure looting rights for Kyle's corpse, including the 44 caliber handgun he had stolen from the gang's previous leader, as well as an ongoing discount on any trade deals for goods coming out of Bloomfield. And if that weren't already a happy enough ending for Bear, we'll go ahead and close things out with one last minor unmarked quest. Although not a prominent part of the design document, it is mentioned that Bear is secretly infatuated with Jillian McKinley. He just kept it to himself, because he believed that someone like Jillian would never hook up with someone like him. Bear would be extremely protective of Jillian if she was returned to Bloomfield, and this would become particularly problematic if the player still needed Jillian's assistance to resolve the situation with Odysseus at the end of Act 1. In that case, the player would either need to neutralize Bear somehow, or earn his trust to the point where he would allow the player to take Jillian back out of the safety of Bloomfield. In the latter case, Bear would insist on coming along. He wouldn't force the player to take them on as a companion, but he would be very upset if his wishes were ignored. While the details are very scarce, the player could apparently learn the reason for Bear's behavior, and even go so far as to play matchmaker, getting the two together. We don't know exactly what this would entail. It was mentioned almost as an afterthought in the design document, but it would net the player the special Cupid epithet as a reward for their efforts. Certainly not the most epic of quests to end things on, but I think easily the most heartwarming. That said, I can see we're going long here, so I feel like this is a pretty good place to wrap things up for now. We do still have a fair amount to talk about. I've got 10 more items on my list, but we'll save that for the next episode. Just to make it clear, the quest to prep the Hermes 13 for launch is particularly complex, and muddled because there's a lot of placeholders and unfinished content in there. But we'll talk about that next time. I'll also say, I'll try to put the next one out on a slightly more timely basis. Honestly, I'm just really stoked to be talking about this series again. So I should hopefully be able to start putting these videos out on a slightly more frequent basis. Anyway, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can find out more about the game by checking out the leaked design documents for yourself, or by visiting the FanRun Wikis. And if you'd like to help support the channel and maybe encourage me to make more videos like this one, then feel free to push the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. As always, links are in the description.